This is the first PowerPoint lecture for the Baxter and Babby textbook. Human inquiry and scientific inquiry about communication is the name of this particular PowerPoint presentation. And really where you start when you think about doing research is at the philosophical level. So how do you know anything? You know a lot of things from being in school for so long, but how do you know? I mean, how are you sure that what you know is true? There are some things we think are true because, well, everyone knows. Everybody knows that. But there is misinformation in the world. For example, drinking 6 to 8 glasses of water a day has been preached for years, although it's completely false. It's based on an article from the late 40s where, if you read it carefully, it means the equivalent of 6 to 8 glasses of water, which includes the food you eat. So the idea of eating your normal food and drinking 6 to 8 glasses of water is not what the article intended. But misinformation, misreading got repeated again, and suddenly it's part of our culture. Everybody knows that you're supposed to drink 6 to 8 glasses of water a day, and everybody's wrong. So we have to think about how it is that we know things. Most of the things that we've heard or that our friends know is what we know. It's based on agreement. We all agree that this is true and this is false. And as I hinted, you can make mistakes, and sometimes what everybody knows is not true. But agreement is pretty powerful. The other way to know is you can have direct experience. If you've been to Washington, D.C., you know what it's like to visit the Washington Monument. You know you have to be there at 8 o'clock in the morning to get a ticket. You know you can't just show up at 3 o'clock in the afternoon. And through observation, you understand people's behavior. If you've observed enough people all using their cell phones, for example, you know that they're really not paying attention to anything else except that phone call. This next slide has to do with the difference between ordinary communication inquiry and scientific. So the ordinary ways that we know something are pretty common. We're going to go over those. Why do we want to study communication? Well, because we would like to predict how things are going to play out when we talk to people or when we listen to people. We want to understand how communication works so we can be good at it. We base our knowledge on authority and tradition. The teacher said so. That's authority. My parents and their parents and their parents believe something. It's a tradition. A lot of religious beliefs are a matter of tradition. In my own family, my children ask me when I first read them Bible stories, do you believe all this stuff? Which is a really tough epistemological question. And I answered it with, of course I believe the Bible stories. And they say, well, why? And I'll say, well, because my father believed them, and his father believed them, and his father believed them. It's a tradition. It's who we are. It's our culture. It's what we believe. That's and where we come from. It's rather simplistic, but it answered the question, so there wasn't another why. Authority is a little bit like religion, but authority is spread to a government report says, or a scientific study showed. Your problem when you deal with citing other people is to learn not to use the word prove, because nothing is proven in science. We find support. We become confident that things are true, but no single study proves anything. And I would admonish you not to use the word proof or prove unless you're presenting some kind of a geometry problem where you're allowed to have a proof. Okay, let's move on now. And this next slide has to do with mistakes you can make. And it's pretty obvious. One thing you can do is you can just see things wrong. So that if you're on the street and your friend is walking towards you and they look right at you but they don't say anything, Your observation is why that was a sign of disrespect. Why is she mad at me? Why is he not talking to me? And your observation may be inaccurate. When you saw them look at you, you just assumed that they were seeing you. Because sometimes people are so lost in thought that they don't even notice their surroundings. Maybe they were on their cell phone and their brain wasn't processing what was happening live in front of them, like you walking toward them or my car pulling in front of them. So inaccurate observations have led to all kinds of merry mix-ups. A lot of TV sitcoms are based on what someone saw, what they thought it meant, and then it takes 20 minutes later, with much humor, they resolve the inaccuracy. Overgeneralization. You may have noticed that certain groups of people behave in certain ways, and so you're tempted to say, for example, oh, I'm behind an old person driving. Old people drive slow. Well, maybe in your observations, most of them do, but that doesn't mean all of them do. It doesn't even mean that most of them do. Maybe you're overgeneralizing the behavior that you see. So that's an example. Stereotyping has a lot to do with overgeneralization. You find a few specific instances of something, and then you say, well, I guess this is going to happen all the time. Led to a lot of superstitions, I believe. A third mistake you can make is selective observation, which is what we use to reinforce our overgeneralizations. So that if we think one ethnic group is particularly lazy, and it's an overgeneralization, or it's something that we were taught by our parents, then every time we see that ethnic group being lazy, that reinforces. We choose to remember that because it matches our stereotype. And if we would happen to see someone in that same group working really hard, or we read a story about somebody, we would tend to forget that. The selective process is called selective retention. You tend not to remember things that cause you to let loose of your deeply held beliefs. So scientists have to be worried about seeing what they want to see or not seeing what they don't want to see. Illogical reasoning is another error in ordinary inquiry. We leap to conclusions. We see something happen, and then we see something happen after that, and we make one of the many fallacies is the one I just described. It's called in Latin post hoc propter hoc, which post means after, and propter means because of. And hoc is just a friendly Latin word for this or that. So if something happens, if something else happens after it, then we assume that it happened because of it. And there's a lot of people who really believe strongly that if they, if a black cat crosses their path, that because it happened, then anything after that is going to be bad. A lot of superstitions are based on illogical reasoning. And there are more common things that you wouldn't even believe that you're making. We'll point those out through the semester. Scientific inquiry is scientific because it guards against the errors of ordinary inquiry. And sometimes you get the question, well, how do you avoid errors? And the simple answer is be careful and make your efforts deliberate or systematic or planned, and then you won't make as many mistakes. There is a part of your chapter about the views of reality, and your author goes on for a couple of columns about the difference between pre-modern, which was before science, and the modern view, which is science, and then this new view called the postmodern view, which really runs afoul of the idea of knowledge. It's hard to know something if everything is socially negotiated and everything is relative to something else. A postmodern view is a very relativist view that nothing really is, it's what we think it is or what we negotiate it to be. And that is a valid view of reality, but it doesn't sit really well with knowing things. Probably it's moving the word knowledge, which is what you came to college for, was to be filled with knowledge and to discover knowledge, and it substitutes it with interpretations. and feelings that are shifting and amorphous. So I'm not a big postmodernist fan, although I do recognize that you need to understand what it is from your reading. The characteristics of scientific inquiry about communication. Well, the heart of the enterprise is theory, data collection, and then the analysis of that data. Theory is a scare word for most students. I suggest that you just get in the habit of, when you see the word theory, that you substitute in your mind the word explanation. That's all theory is. It's an explanation. And so it also makes ridiculous some derogatory ways you might talk about theories. Imagine yourself saying, well, that's all well and good in explanation, but I want to really understand it. It makes no sense. But people will say, well, that's all good in theory, but I want to know what's really working. Theory becomes this kind of a word that's weaker than true explanation, which is not the case. So you need a potential explanation, and sometimes that explanation comes first, and then you test it. And with more qualitative research, it becomes something that comes last, where you collect your data and then you derive an explanation from that. If you remember from previous schooling, it's a difference between deductive logic and inductive logic. Scientific inquiry is an empirical enterprise. So empirical is one of those words you see a lot in college, and nobody really knows what it means. It means that it can be observed or measured. So empirical has to be with observable. Why don't they just say observable? Well, because it's college, and you need to use college words. So you'll leave here saying empirical, and people will scratch their heads. Scientific inquiry also looks for patterns, which your book calls social regularities, because you're studying communication. Patterns in the way people communicate is a social enterprise, and regularities is the name they give to it. Social regularities, or rules for when you meet someone, you're bound by certain traditions that you're supposed to look them in the eye, although in other cultures you're not supposed to look them in the eye. You're supposed to shake their hands, although in other cultures you're supposed to bow or something like that. So social regularities are culturally defined, but they are something that we can study. Also, scientific inquiry looks at groups of people, not individuals. Again, it's college, so we don't call them groups. We call them aggregates, because they are people aggregated into groups. It would be simpler if we just called them groups, but we don't. We call them aggregates. So when you get into your research, you can, and someone's being studied, you can say, oh, don't worry, we're not collecting any personal information on you. This data is being aggregated and your identity is lost. We're just studying 1,000 people or 100 people or 20 people, and we're not looking at you in particular. Although some communication research is about one person, but we'll get to that later in the semester. There's a definition in your book on page 11 which may or may not match all the definitions you've seen in your other communication textbooks, but this one's put out there. I don't expect you to remember it, except that it's communication study is broad, and it's not limited to just words. It can be symbols and gestures, and it can be mediated also. But memorizing definition will not get you very far in this class. You have to understand it in order you can make your own definition out of it. So communication is the primary phenomenon of the study that makes it a comm research study. There are all kinds of disciplines, psychology, sociology, that involve communication, but not as directly as we do in communication. So we're looking at how are messages produced. How are they transmitted? If it's not face-to-face, is it over your cell phone? Is it texting? Are you emailing? Are you broadcasting over a commercial radio station? And then how are those messages interpreted? Meaning making is a term usually associated with qualitative research, not quantitative research. And your authors are very careful to present both points of view in this book. Communication researchers study the content and form of messages. So when you choose your topics, you need to be thinking about these criteria. Am I looking at the means of message transmission? Am I looking at the messages themselves? Am I looking at the message production, the message interpretation, or the meaning making? If your study doesn't involve communication in one of those ways, then your study is not a communication topic, and I will disapprove it. So if you're really interested in coming up with a cool topic for your project, don't make it about grades and drinking or something like that. I mean, those are two variables. Grades do affect drinking, and I would argue that, like for example, the worse your grades, the more you might be tempted to drink. Most people think of it the other way. Drinking influences your grades. If you binge all night before the test, you probably won't do well on the exam. Anyway, from your research then, you're looking for how do these messages function and what is their effect. Those are two very separate areas, although some people combine them. Effect would be kids watch this certain type of TV show. There's a dysfunctional effect. One of them is they become desensitized to violence, or perhaps they become disinterested in getting exercise outside and they become a little tub of lard. The function of messages is what I'm really interested in. How do people use the media? Not what the media do to us, but how do the media function? How is it different to text versus to email versus to talk face to face? I'm very interested in how messages function and how do they communicate. But you can choose just about anything you want in this class for your topic. Another thing in Chapter 1 is how the research is disseminated. There's basically two types. It's either private or public. So you're told that most research, especially academic research, is for public consumption. We collect the data and we publish it in journals and in book chapters and sometimes in books. We present our papers at conferences. We give lectures. That's public research, and that's the research you're going to be learning this semester. The other type of research is the kind that you can use when you're working at a company. If your boss hires you to find out something about the customer that will give your company a competitive edge over your the guy down the street, well, then that's proprietary research, meaning it's private. You don't want your competition to know what your $10,000 study learned about the product or the customer or the service, because then they will have gotten an unfair advantage over the money that you spent on research. So that's where most of it's not proprietary with us. You may choose a topic where the only information that's available is proprietary. In those cases where you can't find public sources of information about what you're interested in, I highly encourage you to switch topics, and I'll help you do that. This concludes Chapter 1. Hope you enjoyed it.